The Vietnam War, they banned you from seeing. Untold horror stories from the front lines. The air itself was a living thing, thick and hot, a wet blanket woven from the sweat of 1,000 men, the rot of a million leaves, and the metallic tang of something that was always just beyond the last breath. This wasn't a place. It was an organism, breathing, festering, and slowly, inexorably, devouring everything that entered its maw. They called it Vietnam. For the boys fresh off the plane, the ones still smelling of PX cologne and hope, the illusion died somewhere between the roar of the C-130's engines and the first sickening thud of their boots on the tarmac at Tan Son Hut. The heat hit them first, a physical blow that stole breath and energy. Then came the smells, jet fuel mixing with human waste, exotic spices mingling with decaying vegetation, and always, underlying everything, the faint, acrid scent of cordite, the ghost of battles past, present, and future. This wasn't the clean, heroic war they'd seen in newsreels. This was something else entirely. It was a suffocating, unrelenting crawl through an emerald hell, where the enemy was as much the jungle itself as the ghost that moved within it. No front lines, not in the traditional sense. Just a perpetual, shifting perimeter of fear that stretched across paddy fields, through triple canopy jungle, and into the shattered remains of villages. Every bush could hold a sniper. Every discarded sandal could be rigged. Every child's smile, a deception. The weight of it all was immediate. The M16 felt like a lead pipe after an hour. The pack, loaded with ammo, sea rations, water, and enough gear to sink a small boat, seemed to fuse with your spine. Sweat ran in rivulets, stinging eyes, soaking uniforms to a dark, permanent sheen. Dehydration was a constant companion, its dry throat whisper a reminder of the fragility of life out here. Your skin, once soft, rapidly toughened, then chafed, then broke out in 1,000 tiny, itching rashes from the heat, the dirt, the bugs, and the perpetual damp. Take Firebase Andromeda, for instance, or what was left of it, just a scar on a hill, hacked out of the jungle with dynamite and sheer grunt labor. Sandbags stacked high, some patched with corrugated steel. Barbed wire, rusted and glinting, stretched in concentric rings, catching the occasional stray leaf, the occasional lost bird. From its precarious perch, you could see the endless green, rolling like a poisoned sea to the horizon. And beyond that horizon, the unknown. Private Miller, a F&G, fucking new guy, barely out of high school, learned his first lesson about the untold horror, not from a firefight, but from the simple act of digging a latrine pit. The shovel bit into the earth, turning up clumps of red clay, roots, and then something else. A femur, clean, bleached white, but undeniably human. And then another and another. This wasn't a burial ground. It was just the ground. History, recent and brutal, layered beneath the soil, awaiting discovery by an unwitting hand. Sergeant Stone, a man whose face was already etched with the deep lines of too many rotations, just grunted. "Welcome to the show, kid. You ain't seen nothing yet." Stone wasn't wrong. The real horrors weren't always the explosions or the bullets. Often, they were far more insidious. It was the constant, low-grade thrum of paranoia. Every rustle in the dense foliage, every distant bird call that seemed just a little too deliberate, every creak of bamboo in the humid breeze. Your ears, your eyes, your very senses became hyper-alert, tuned to a frequency of danger. You learned to distinguish the innocent snap of a twig from the calculated, deliberate pressure of a boot. You learned to smell the enemy, that faint, earthy smell of wood smoke and old rice, mixed with something else, something primal and predatory. On patrol, the world narrowed to a tunnel. Your rifle, the back of the man in front of you, and the immediate jungle. Step, place foot, check for tripwires, for disturbed earth, for anything out of place. Repeat. For hours, days, the M16, initially a weapon of power, became an extension of your body, heavy and familiar. Your finger rested near the trigger guard always. Your eyes scanned, flicked, darted, searching for the telltale glint of an AK-47 barrel, the subtle sheen of an enemy's skin amidst the shadows, the nearly invisible wire of a punji trap. The jungle itself was a master torturer. Leeches, fat and dark, dropped from trees or clung to legs, leaving bloody trails when pulled off. Mosquitoes, thick as clouds, sang their high-pitched song of malaria and dengue. Fire ants swarmed, their bites like tiny, burning needles. And then there were the serpents, the centipedes, the scorpions, all just part of the everyday tapestry of misery. The heat was a living furnace, especially in the sun-drenched clearings. Water was a precious commodity, always rationed, always tasting faintly of plastic and purification tablets. And the silence. That was often the worst. Not the everyday silence of a forest, but the pregnant, heavy quiet that descended just before something truly awful was about to happen. A hush that swallowed the chirping insects, the distant thrum of choppers, the very breath of the men. In that silence, your own heartbeat pounded like a drum, and every nerve screamed. One afternoon, during a search and destroy mission through an abandoned hamlet, the squad moved with practiced, weary caution. The thatched huts, long since deserted, stood like skeletal ghosts, their roofs sagging, their interiors ransacked. The air hung thick with the dust of decay and the memory of lives interrupted. They moved through the remnants of a kitchen, a rusted wok, a broken clay pot, when Specialist Ramos, point man, froze. His hand shot up a silent signal. The squad dropped, melting into the shadows, rifles pointed. Nothing, just the oppressive heat, the buzzing of flies, and the thudding of their own hearts. Ramos, eyes wide, slowly lowered his rifle, then pointed a trembling finger. Tacked to a wooden beam at eye level was a child's drawing. Crayon on rice paper, a vibrant, smiling sun, a stick figure family holding hands. And beneath it, scrawled in bold, red paint, a message in broken English. GI, you will die here. No booby trap, no tripuire, no ambus. Just a message, a simple, chilling declaration of absolute certainty. The psychological impact was immediate, far more effective than 1,000 rounds of ammunition. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. And it was signed, not by an enemy soldier, but by the very land itself. Sergeant Stone just looked at it for a long moment, then spat. "Move out," he rasped, his voice rougher than usual. But the order lacked its usual conviction. They moved, but the quickening pace wasn't from urgency, but from a desperate need to escape the silent, mocking power of that image. That was the untold horror they didn't show you. The slow, grinding erosion of the soul. The way the enemy wasn't always a uniform, but a whisper, a smell, a drawing. The way the jungle breathed, watched, and waited. The way it promised, with unwavering conviction, that you, too, would leave a part of yourself behind. Or all of it. And for those who made it out, scarred and hollowed, the war would follow them, a permanent fixture in the landscape of their minds, whispering its horrors long after the choppers had flown them home. The show, as Stone had said, had only just begun. The choppers' whine faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the humidity, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from a million buzzing insects and the unseen exhalation of the jungle itself. It was a silence that screamed. This was their new god, this pulsating green maw, and it promised nothing but exhaustion, fear, and a slow, inexorable stripping away of everything that made them men. Sergeant Miller, his face already slick with sweat and resignation, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the tangled roots at his feet. "All right, gentlemen, welcome to the meat grinder. Let's move." They were deep in the A-Shao, a name that tasted like rust and dread on the tongue. An emerald hell where the enemy was as much the terrain as the ghost in the black pajamas. The canopy overhead was a dense, interlocking shield, filtering the sun into sickly green shafts that struggled to pierce the gloom. The air was a living thing, hot and wet, thick with the smell of decay, damp earth, strange, potent blossoms, and the metallic tang of their own fear. Every breath was a struggle, pulling in the fungal rot and the promise of disease. The ground underfoot was a treacherous mosaic of slick mud, hidden roots, and thorny vines that clawed at their fatigues, trying to trip them, to hold them, to mark them. Each step was a deliberate act of will, a fight against gravity and the jungle's insistence on reclaiming its own. The men moved in a wary, staggered line, their M16s held at the ready, eyes scanning, always scanning. For what? For movement? For a flicker of camouflage in the impenetrable foliage? For the glint of a tripwire? For a shadow that didn't quite belong? This wasn't the enemy they trained for on a firing range. This was an enemy that breathed the same air, that bled into the very earth they walked. It wasn't always a uniform, a human shape in their crosshairs. More often, it was a whisper, the sudden snap of a twig not made by one of their own, the rustle of leaves that seemed too deliberate, too close. It was a smell, the faint, acrid scent of stale cigarette smoke, or the inexplicable, cloying sweetness of something rotten that wasn't quite natural decay, something suggesting a recent human presence. Private Johnson, barely 18, his youth already starting to fray at the edges, stumbled, catching himself before he went down. A thick, dark leech, bloated like a miniature black grape, clung to his forearm, already burrowing. He yelped, a sound quickly stifled, as Miller's stony gaze fixed on him. Quiet, goddammit! You want to ring the dinner bell? Johnson tore the leech off with a grimace, a bead of blood welling up. Another small victory for the jungle. The longer they walked, the more the jungle pressed in a claustrophobic embrace. The sounds were overwhelming, yet maddeningly ambiguous. The ceaseless drone of unseen insects, the distant shriek of exotic birds, the drip of water from unseen leaves. And underneath it all, a subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm, like the slow, deep breath of something immense and ancient. The jungle watched. They felt it in the prickle on their necks, in the way their skin crawled despite the sweat. It was a living eye, patient, omnipresent. Then, PFC Ramirez froze, his hand shooting up, fist clenched. Miller halted the patrol with a silent gesture. Every man dropped low. M16s pointed into the verdant chaos. Ramirez pointed to a tree, a thick, gnarled trunk half-eaten by fungi, carved crudely into its bark, barely visible through the moss, was a symbol. A simple drawing, two lines meeting at an angle, like a simplified arrow or a bird's foot. Nothing overtly threatening, but in this place, in this silence, it screamed. It was a mark, a sign, a message. VC, Miller breathed, his voice a low rasp. Recent. The unseen enemy wasn't just a threat. It was a psychological weapon. It permeated everything. Every shadow might conceal a sniper. Every innocent-looking vine might be a tripwire connected to a bouncing Betty that would detonate at groin level, shredding flesh and bone. Every discarded biscuit wrapper, every half-smoked cigarette, but every subtle disturbance in the undergrowth was a clue, a taunt, a reminder that they were never truly alone. And they were never truly safe. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the shifting light and the increasing weight of their packs, their fear, and the pervasive exhaustion that seeped into their bones. Legs ached, shoulders burned, and the constant vigilance hammered at their sanity. Minds began to play tricks. Johnson swore he saw a face in the dense foliage, a momentary flicker of dark eyes and a conical hat. He blinked, and it was gone, just leaves and shadows. Miller, too, found himself staring at patterns in the branches, half expecting them to resolve into something sinister. The jungle promised, with unwavering conviction, that you, too, would leave a part of yourself behind, or all of it. It promised that the easy laughter, the innocent dreams, the very core of who you were before this green hell consumed you, would be slowly, meticulously devoured. It was a war fought not just for territory, but for the soul. And for those who made it out, scarred and hollowed, the war would follow them. A permanent fixture in the landscape of their minds, whispering its horrors long after the choppers had flown them home. The show, as Stone had said, had only just begun, and this particular performance, deep within the A Shao, was just settling into its agonizing first act. They pushed on, one foot in front of the other, deeper into the maw, closer to whatever terrible revelation the jungle held next. The A Shao. The name itself was a rasp in the throat, a whispered curse in the humid air, a valley of ghosts and relentless, indifferent green. It wasn't just a geographical location. It was a state of being, a slow, agonizing descent into a realm where the laws of man and sanity frayed, then snapped. They had pushed on, as the order dictated, deeper into its maw, each footfall a leaden echo in the sodden earth, each breath a struggle against the air itself, thick, wet, and heavy with the scent of decay and blooming things that were both beautiful and venomous. The jungle here wasn't just dense, it was an active, malevolent entity. It swallowed light, chewed sound, and exhaled an oppressive heat that clung to skin like a shroud. The canopy overhead was a tangled, interwoven mat of leaves and vines, ancient and impenetrable, filtering the sun into weak, shimmering shafts that barely pierced the gloom. Below, the undergrowth was a Gordian knot of bamboo thickets, thorny bushes, and elephant grass that stood taller than a man, its serrated edges sharp enough to draw blood with a careless brush. Movement was a constant, brutal negotiation, hacking through lianas that coiled like snakes, scrambling over slick, moss-covered roots, wading through unseen pools of stagnant water where leeches waited like silent, hungry black coins. Every man was a walking swamp of his own making. Sweat plastered fatigues to skin, ran in rivulets down faces, stinging eyes, soaking crotches. The stench of their own fear, mixed with stale Saracen cheese, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present, cloying sweetness of rot, was a constant companion. Packs, laden with ammunition, water, rations, and the tools of their grim trade, weighed like millstones. Each step was a deliberate act of will, a fight against gravity and the insidious pull of exhaustion. Lungs burned, thighs ached, and the mind, denied the simple relief of open space or clear sight, began its own slow, desperate dance with paranoia. Every rustle in the dense foliage, every distant bird call, every subtle shift in the wind's whisper became a potential trigger. Was it the faint click of a safety being released? The soft creak of bamboo under a cautious foot? The guttural murmur of a language not their own? Eyes, bloodshot and ringed with fatigue, scanned the green kaleidoscope, searching for the impossible. A hidden tripwire, the barely perceptible gleam of an enemy helmet through the leaves, a strand of spider silk indicating a path recently used. The jungle, they understood, was not empty. It was teeming, vibrant, and somewhere within it, waiting, watching, was an enemy who knew its every secret, who moved through it like a ghost. The leeches were an ever-present torment, a reminder of the insidious ways the jungle sought to claim them. They attached themselves silently, efficiently, bloated sacks of stolen blood, leaving behind small, weeping wounds that bled for hours thanks to their anticoagulant saliva. Malaria, dysentery, jungle rot. The invisible enemies were as deadly as any bullet. A man could go down not from a firefight, but from a sudden, violent fever that left him shaking and delirious, or from an infection that ate away at flesh, turning a simple cut into a festering horror. The body, constantly battling the environment, was slowly being consumed from within. One afternoon, the point man, a gaunt kid named Miller who had seen too much in too few months, froze. His hand shot up, finger splayed, the universal sign for halt. The line behind him stopped instantly, movements fluid despite the exhaustion. The jungle's symphony of buzzing insects and chirping birds seemed to dim, replaced by the thumping of their own hearts in their ears. Miller, eyes wide and fixed, pointed to a small, almost imperceptible disturbance in the leaf litter at the base of a towering banyan tree. A twig, broken but not rotten, lay at an unnatural angle, barely noticeable, yet to Miller's hypertuned senses, it screamed booby trap. Sergeant Reyes, A grizzled veteran whose face was a roadmap of forgotten battles, moved up cautiously. He knelt, his M16 held at the ready, and peered at the spot. The air tightened. Every man held his breath. This wasn't a firefight. No grand explosion, no heroic charge. This was the silent, agonizing terror of the unseen, the insidious trap laid by an enemy who knew they would pass this way. Reyes, with a pair of long, practiced fingers, gently nudged the twig. Nothing. He probed the ground around it with the barrel of his rifle. Slowly, meticulously, he uncovered it. A pressure plate, thin as a dinner plate, expertly camouflaged, connected to a buried grenade. The relief that washed through the platoon was almost sickening, leaving them weak-kneed. But it was fleeting. The discovery wasn't a reprieve, it was a warning. It meant the NVA were here, had been here, were still here. They were moving ahead of them, or behind them, or perhaps, God help them, watching them right now, just beyond the screen of green, anticipating their next move. The jungle became not just a path, but a grid of potential death, each step a gamble. The act of finding a trap, defusing it, was a hollow victory. It merely confirmed the omnipresent danger, reinforcing the truth that this was a war fought not just with bullets, but with patience, cunning, and the raw, relentless erosion of the human spirit. For some, the constant tension manifested in nervous tics, a twitch of the eye, an incessant chewing of the lip, a compulsive clearing of the throat. For others, it was a withdrawal, a retreat into a silent, internal world where the jungle's horrors were magnified by the mind's own demons. Conversations grew sparse, limited to terse commands and warnings. Laughter, once a release, had become a rarity, replaced by a grim, shared understanding that mirth was a luxury they could ill afford. Even sleep offered little solace, haunted by nightmares that were mere replays of the waking day or dark premonitions of what was to come. They slept fitfully, if at all, curled around their rifles, their minds still on high alert, listening to the jungle's nocturnal symphony of unknown creatures and imagined threats. Private Thomas, a new arrival, fresh from training and still carrying the naive sheen of youth, stumbled. His foot caught a root, and he pitched forward, his rifle clattering against a tree trunk. The sound, amplified 100-fold in the stifling silence, was like a thunderclap. Every man froze. Eyes darted, weapons snapped up, fingers hovering on triggers. Thomas, mortified, scrambled back to his feet, eyes wide with terror, expecting a hail of bullets to erupt from the trees. Nothing. Only the accelerated thumping of his own heart and the slow, deliberate turning of heads towards him, eyes filled with a mixture of annoyance and the raw, primal fear that his mistake could have cost them all. He learned then, a lesson etched deep into his soul. In the A Shao, there were no minor errors, only potential fatalities. The landscape itself began to warp their perception. The oppressive green, the constant lack of horizon, the sensation of being perpetually enclosed began to blur the lines between reality and hallucination. Exhaustion-induced mirages flickered in the periphery, a fleeting shape in the undergrowth that vanished upon closer inspection, the whisper of a familiar voice carried on a non-existent breeze. The jungle, with its suffocating embrace, was slowly erasing the world they knew, replacing it with its own grotesque, primal logic. They pushed on, following trails that sometimes dissolved into nothingness, guided by instinct and the grim determination to complete a mission whose true purpose remained obscured, hinted at only by hushed commands and the constant, unspoken threat of court-martial for insubordination. Each passing hour hammered home the brutal truth. They were pawns in a game far larger and more terrifying than they could comprehend. They were simply moving pieces, expendable bodies driven deeper into an escalating nightmare. The agonizing first act was indeed settling in, but it felt less like a beginning and more like an endless, suffocating middle. As dusk began to bleed into the oppressive jungle, painting the few visible patches of sky in bruised purples and blood oranges, they stumbled upon something new. Not a trap this time, nor a discarded cigarette. This was a clearing, roughly circular, carved out of the impenetrable growth with an almost surgical precision. In its center, rising from the matted earth, stood a crude, yet undeniably menacing structure. A series of sharpened bamboo stakes, impaled with decaying animal carcasses. Rats, a civet cat, a monkey, their putrefying forms arranged in a grotesque circle. And beyond them, hanging from a low branch of a gnarled tree, swaying gently in the barely perceptible breeze, was a human skull, bleached white, its empty eye sockets staring out into the encroaching darkness. A silent, chilling message. This was not just a trail or a hiding place. This was a statement, a boundary, a desecrated altar. And in the sudden, profound silence that fell upon the platoon, broken only by the incessant buzzing of flies around the grim display, every man knew with a cold, sickening certainty that they had just crossed a threshold. The maw had fully opened, and whatever terrible revelation the jungle held next, it was no longer just a possibility. It was waiting for them, just beyond the circle of bones. The silence was a thick, suffocating shroud, heavier than the humidity, more penetrating than the stench of decay. It wasn't the natural quiet of the jungle, but an unnatural hush, as if the very air had been sucked dry of sound, leaving only the frantic drum of individual heartbeats and the insolent buzz of flies performing their macabre dance around the piled bones. Sergeant Miller, a man whose skin had seen more suns and more blood than he cared to count, felt the hair on his arms prickle. He'd seen plenty of death, plenty of desecration, but this was different. This wasn't just hate. This was something colder, older, a primordial malice that seeped from the very earth beneath their boots, a promise of exquisite suffering. Captain Vance, his face a mask of grim determination that did little to hide the tremor in his hands, finally broke the spell. Perimeter, tight. His voice was a strained whisper, raw with the effort of control, swallowed almost immediately by the dense foliage. The men moved like automatons, their every motion stiff, burdened by an invisible weight. No one spoke. The easy camaraderie, the gallows humor, the shared misery, it had all evaporated, replaced by a profound, individual terror. Each man was now an island, adrift in a sea of his own dread, trying not to look into the eyes of the man next to him, lest he see his own fear reflected back tenfold. Private Davies, barely 18, clutched his M16 like a lifeline, the cool metal a solitary comfort against the burning heat of his fear. He kept seeing the small, charred bones, the child's skull, imagining its silent scream, its tiny eye sockets staring into his soul, accusing. His mouth was dry, his tongue a sandpaper rag. He wanted to throw up, to purge the image, but there was nothing in his stomach, just a knot of cold fear that twisted tighter with every labored breath. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, every creak of the straining jungle canopy became a harbinger of doom. He could feel eyes on him, not just the enemies, but something else, something ancient and malevolent, rising from the earth itself, stirring in the stagnant air. "We gotta move, Captain," Miller rumbled, his voice low, gravelly, betraying none of the cold dread coiling in his gut. "Staying put here is just asking for it. We're in their crosshairs already." Vance nodded, a jerky motion. He knew Miller was right. But which way? Forward into the unseen maw, or back through the desecrated path? Both options tasted like bile, like rust and ash. North. Keep to the high ground. Slow and steady. Eyes open. Assume everything's a trap. Vance's orders were mechanical, devoid of his usual command presence, a hollow echo of a leader who was just as lost as his men. He was just a man, like the rest of them, staring into an abyss that promised no bottom. The advance was agonizing. Every step was deliberate, painfully slow, each bootfall squishing into the mud, each sound amplified in the suffocating quiet. The jungle, already a formidable adversary of heat, humidity, and biting insects, now transformed into a living, breathing entity of pure menace. The canopy grew denser, filtering out the already weak sunlight, plunging them into a perpetual twilight, a green-tinged gloom that played tricks on the eyes. The air became heavier, thick with the smell of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and something else, a faint, sickly sweet scent that reminded Davies of a neglected grave, of something long dead but still lingering. Vines, thick as a man's arm, snaked across their path, appearing to coil and twitch in their peripheral vision, like dormant serpents awaiting a signal. Roots, gnarled and contorted, tripped them, sending jolts of panic through their systems, each stumble a near-fatal misstep. Private Jenkins, a quiet kid from Alabama, suddenly stopped dead, his body rigid, pointing a trembling finger into the gloom. "Did you see that?" His voice was a thin, reedy whisper, barely audible above the insistent hum of the insects. "See what, Jenkins?" Miller asked, his own nerves frayed, his hand instinctively tightening on his rifle. A shadow, just there, behind that tree, like it moved. Too fast. Miller scanned the dense foliage, his eyes straining in the dim light. Nothing, just the endless, oppressive green, an impenetrable wall of leaves and vines. "Must have been a monkey, Jenkins. Keep moving." But Jenkins shook his head, his eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on a point only he could see. "No, not a monkey. It was too tall, too still, like it was waiting." The incident, small as it was, ignited the latent paranoia in the platoon. Men started seeing things or thinking they saw things. A glint of metal that turned out to be a dewdrop on a leaf. A flash of movement that was only a bird taking flight. The jungle played tricks on them, distorting reality, feeding their fear, turning innocuous shadows into lurking threats. Hydration became a forgotten necessity. Their throats were dry not from thirst, but from terror, their mouths tasting of metal. Then came the sounds, not the crack of a rifle or the thud of a mortar, but something far more insidious. Faint whispers, carried on the humid air, just at the edge of hearing, elusive and tormenting. Sometimes it sounded like children crying, faint and distant, a ghostly echo of the bones they had left behind. Other times, like muffled, mocking laughter, taunting them from unseen cover. Or the low, guttural chanting of a ritual, a primal incantation woven into the very fabric of the jungle. Each man heard something different or thought he did, but the collective experience was the same. A creeping sense of being watched, stalked, and slowly, systematically driven insane. Their sanity, already frayed, was being slowly unraveled, thread by agonizing thread. PFC Rodriguez, a hardened urban warrior from Chicago, stumbled, then yelled, a guttural cry of shock and frustration. Christ, what the hell was that? He'd stepped on a pressure plate. But instead of an explosion, a series of crude, sharpened bamboo stakes, smeared with human feces and animal offal, sprang up from the ground around his legs, tearing at his fatigues, missing his flesh by inches, spraying him with putrid grime. The near miss sent a shockwave through the platoon. This wasn't just a simple booby trap. This was designed for maximum psychological impact, to make them flinch, to break their focus, to remind them that every step was a gamble with their lives, and worse, with their sanity. The enemy wasn't just trying to kill them, they were trying to break them. They're playing with us, gritted Doc Adams, the medic, examining Rodriguez's torn trousers with a grimace of disgust, trying to rattle us apart before they even show themselves. This isn't about killing, it's about terror. The psychological warfare intensified. They found another marker, a discarded U.S. helmet, not just riddled with bullet holes, but meticulously picked clean of flesh, bleached white, and set atop a tall bamboo pole, facing their direction of travel. In its empty eye sockets, two large black beetles had been impaled, still twitching, their legs struggling against the cruel spikes. It was a grotesque mockery, a direct message of contempt and inevitable fate, a chilling reminder of who they were and what they were becoming. The jungle itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for their reaction. But the worst was yet to come. As they navigated a particularly dense section of ancient, gnarled trees, their roots snaking across the forest floor like the tentacles of some subterranean beast. The ground under Private Jenkins gave way. Not a fall into a pungy pit, but a sudden, gaping collapse into a hidden tunnel system, dug deep beneath the roots, a black maw within the maw. He screamed, a raw, terrified sound ripped from the deepest part of his being, as he disappeared from view, leaving only a cloud of disturbed earth and the sickening echo of his fear. The men rushed to the edge of the collapse, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Below, in the almost total darkness, they could hear Jenkins thrashing, his cries muffled, desperate. "I am stuck. I can't move. Get me out." Miller grabbed a flashlight, shining its beam down the narrow, earthen shaft. Jenkins was wedged awkwardly, his legs pinned, one arm bent at a grotesque angle. But it wasn't just the tight space that was making him scream. The tunnel floor was alive with movement, a glistening, scuttling horror. Centipedes, giant, glistening black centipedes, thick as Miller's thumb, their countless legs skittering over Jenkins' face, his arms, his exposed neck. They were everywhere, crawling from the dank earth, from fissures in the tunnel walls, swarming towards the light, towards the warmth of his flesh. "Get them off me! Get them off!" Jenkins was sobbing, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated horror, a sound that would haunt their dreams for years to come. "Hold still, Jenkins! We're coming!" Miller yelled, but the shaft was too narrow, too unstable. They tried to dig him out, clawing at the loose earth with their hands. But the more they dug, the more the tunnel threatened to collapse further, sending down showers of dirt and more of the abhorrent creatures. The centipedes, disturbed by the light and noise, began to bite. Jenkins' screams turned into choked gasps, then whimpers, each fading cry a dagger to their souls. Doc Adams, grim-faced, reached down with a stick, trying to brush the creatures away, but they were relentless, drawn to the moisture and warmth of Jenkins' skin, a living, venomous blanket. The bites were excruciating, venomous, burning like acid, sending fiery pain through his nerves. The tunnel filled with the frantic rustling of their chitinous bodies. The sickly sweet smell intensified, now mingled with the metallic tang of fear and a hint of something more putrid. Captain Vance made a snap decision, a desperate, impossible choice that tore at his gut. "We can't get him out, not without bringing the whole thing down. We'll lose more men." His voice was hollow, devoid of hope, a death knell. "What do you mean, Captain? We just leave him?" Rodriguez demanded, aghast, his face a mask of disbelief and disgust. "He's bitten, God knows how many times, and the tunnel's unstable. It's a death trap, a grave for all of us if we try." Vance's eyes were pleading, begging for understanding, for forgiveness, for an absolution he knew he would never find. Jenkins was still down there, his whimpers growing weaker, interspersed with desperate, choked coughs, the sounds of a man drowning in a sea of living horror. The centipedes were a living shroud, a writhing, biting mass. "No, don't leave me, please." His voice was barely audible now, fading into the rustling horror, swallowed by the earth itself. Miller watched, paralyzed, his own breath catching in his throat. He'd seen men die, plenty of them, but never like this. Entombed alive, devoured by a legion of venomous insects, screaming for help that would never come. It was an unspeakable torture, a fate worse than any bullet, any grenade. Then, with a final, heart-wrenching sob, Jenkins went silent. Only the rustling of the centipedes remained, a hideous symphony of the jungle's cruel maw. Vance gave the order, his voice barely a whisper, a ghost of command. "Move out." The men didn't look at each other. They didn't speak. They simply turned, their faces pale, eyes haunted, their souls scarred, and walked away from the living tomb, leaving Jenkins to his unspeakable end. The unspoken question hung heavy in the humid air, a poison cloud. Whose turn was it next? The maw had claimed another, not with a bang, but with 1,000 tiny, venomous bites. And the whispers in the green seemed to grow louder, more confident, more defined, as if mocking their retreat. They were no longer just soldiers. They were prey, trapped in a game designed by unseen masters, in a jungle that had become a sentient, malevolent entity. And the threshold, they realized with chilling clarity, was not just a place they had crossed, but a state of being they had entered, from which there was no return, only a deeper descent into the horror. The descent was no longer metaphorical. It was a physical plunge into a realm where the laws of man bent and broke under the weight of the jungle's indifferent, ancient will. They were past the threshold now, deep into the belly of the beast, where every rustle was a potential threat, every shadow a lurking predator, and every breath drawn tasted of rot and fear. Specialist Rabbit Molina, barely 18 and clutching his M16 like a drowning man clutching driftwood, felt the rot seep into his bones first. It wasn't just the smell of decaying vegetation, the cloying sweetness of jasmine mixing with stagnant water and human waste. It was the insidious damp that never left, the way his uniform clung to him like a second skin, perpetually soaked with sweat and the green slime of the undergrowth. His feet, once pink and unblemished, were now a landscape of craters and raw patches, a testament to the ever-present trench foot that gnawed at them, despite the frantic, twice-daily powdering. Every step was a fresh agony, a searing reminder of how far they were from any semblance of civilization. The company had been whittled down, not just by direct contact, but by the jungle itself. Malaria had claimed Sergeant Miller, his eyes yellowed and delirious as he thrashed in the stifling heat, muttering about angels with bayonets before slipping into a coma from which he never woke. Dysentery had halved their rations and their strength, leaving men too weak to stand watch, their guts a constant battlefield of cramping agony and explosive evacuation. These weren't the heroic deaths painted in recruitment posters. These were ignoble, slow degradations, witnessed by no one but their equally suffering comrades. The unseen masters of this game, the VC, used the jungle as their weapon, their shield, their very consciousness. The whispered warnings Ray had heard from the veterans weren't just about booby traps or snipers. They were about the absolute surrender to paranoia. Now he understood. A sudden downpour would begin, not with distant thunder, but with the immediate, deafening roar of water hammering the triple canopy, instantly drowning out all other sounds. A perfect cover for movement, for ambush. Then, just as suddenly, it would cease, leaving an unnatural, ringing silence that screamed of unseen eyes. The tiny, venomous bites were constant, maddening torment. Not just mosquitoes, but swarms of biting ants that could make a man tear at his own flesh, centipedes that scuttled into boots during the night, and the ever-present leeches. They clung to exposed skin, engorging themselves on blood, leaving behind weeping sores that refused to heal in the oppressive humidity. One morning, PFC Jones found a leech latched onto his eyeball. An inch-long horror he'd somehow slept through, its body pulsating with his own stolen lifeblood. The frantic, screaming removal had been one of the worst sounds Ray had ever heard, a primal shriek of violated flesh. But worse than the physical was the psychological. The jungle was alive, and it seemed to resent their intrusion. The canopy above was a perpetual green gloom, filtering out all but slivers of brutal sunlight, making the world below a twilight realm even at midday. The air hung thick and heavy, laden with the smell of decay and a strange, metallic tang that some claimed was the scent of blood long since spilled. Every snapped twig, every chirping bird, every distant monkey call seemed to carry a hidden message, a warning or a mocking jeer. The whispers from the context weren't just growing louder. They were coalescing, forming into coherent threats that drilled into the core of their sanity. One afternoon, during a halt that felt less like a rest and more like a collective prayer for death, Sergeant Cole, a man who had seen 3 tours and rarely flinched, began to speak to the trees. He wasn't yelling, not initially. He was reasoning with them, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, explaining why they needed to pass, promising not to hurt them if they just let them through. The men watched him, hollow-eyed, a mix of pity and chilling recognition in their gazes. They were all seeing things now. Shadows moving where there were no shadows, faces forming in the patterns of leaves, hearing their names called in the wind. The line between reality and hallucination, already thin, was dissolving like sugar in hot tea. The booby traps were a silent, indiscriminate slaughter. Not always the loud explosions that tore limbs from torsos, but the more insidious ones. The punji stakes, sharpened bamboo poisoned with excrement, designed not to kill quickly, but to incapacitate, to fester, to draw out the agony and tie up resources. They found PFC Sanchez impaled on a pit of them, his eyes wide and unseeing, his mouth open in a soundless scream. But it was this smell that defined it, the stench of his own infection already blooming in the humid air, a grotesque testament to the jungle's efficiency. Lieutenant Davies, a fresh-faced officer barely out of West Point, ordered the body to be left. "We can't carry him," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He's gone. We move." The words hung heavy, a brutal declaration of their diminished humanity. They were no longer burying their dead. They were abandoning them to the jungle's embrace, leaving them to become part of its fertile, terrifying cycle. As they pushed deeper, the feeling of being hunted intensified. It wasn't just the enemy now, it was everything. The land itself was conspiring against them. Rivers swollen with recent rains became torrents that threatened to sweep them away. Swamps choked with razor grass and unseen dangers swallowed men up to their waists, each step a gamble. They were losing more men to the environment than to direct firefights, and the realization was a corrosive acid on their morale. "This ain't a war," muttered Specialist Barnes, his face a gaunt mask of stubble and exhaustion. "This is a goddamn slaughterhouse." And with the livestock, he wasn't wrong. They were no longer fighting for ideals or even for victory. They were fighting for the next breath, the next step, the simple, brutal act of survival. Every fiber of their being screamed for escape, for the clean, predictable world they'd left behind, a world that now seemed as distant as a forgotten dream. The threshold, they understood now, with chilling clarity, was not just a place they had crossed. It was a state of being, a continuous, agonizing descent into a horror that stripped away dignity, purpose, and the very essence of what it meant to be human. There was no return, only a deeper plunge into the maw of a jungle that had become a sentient, malevolent entity, eager to consume them, one tortured breath, one festering wound, one lost soul at a time. And as the distant, mocking cries of a gibbon echoed through the oppressive green, Ray Molina closed his eyes, no longer able to distinguish between the animal's lament and the faint, familiar whispers of his own encroaching madness. Ray Molina's eyelids fluttered, thin membranes fighting against the searing light that bled through the triple canopy. The gibbon's cry, a banshee wail that had clung to the humid air like a shroud, morphed, twisting into something else, something internal. It was a lament, yes, but also a chorus of hushed voices, 1,000 invisible mouths whispering his name, urging him, coaxing him towards the precipice of understanding, or perhaps dissolution. He tasted metal and bile, a phantom aftertaste of fear and exhaustion that had long since become his daily bread. "Molina, on your feet, grunt. Let's move." Sergeant McAllister's voice, a gravelly rasp that still carried the barest hint of authority, cut through the din of Ray's internal world. Mac, a man whose face was etched with the cartography of 1,000 sleepless nights and an equal number of grim decisions, watched him with eyes that saw too much, understood too little, and accepted even less. Ray pushed himself up, the ground beneath him a squelching mess of decaying leaves and mud that seemed to inhale his boots with each step. His body was a collection of aches and tremors, a meat puppet controlled by strings of pure, unadulterated dread. The patrol began, another brutal crawl through the suffocating green. The air was a thick, wet blanket, clinging to their skin, saturating their fatigues until they felt like leaden second skins. Every breath was a struggle, every sound a potential death knell. The jungle itself seemed to breathe, a colossal, predatory organism. Tendrils of vine, gnarled roots, and monstrous ferns clawed at them, tearing at their clothes, snagging their weapons, constantly reminding them of their unwelcome intrusion. Sunlight, when it pierced the canopy, did so in blinding, fractured shafts, illuminating the swirling humidity and the buzzing clouds of insects that feasted on their sweat and blood. Doc Miller, usually walking with a stoic, detached gait, seemed to drag his feet today. His medical pack, stained and worn, appeared heavier than usual, not just with bandages and morphine, but with the accumulating weight of the horrors he'd witnessed and patched up, often in vain. He stole glances at Ray, his brow furrowed with a concern that mirrored Mac's. Doc had seen enough men break, had seen the light drain from their eyes before the enemy even fired a shot. Ray was on that path, a highway paved with good intentions and shattered sanity. "Anything on the radio, Mac?" "Private First Class, Snake." Riley's voice was thin, reedy, barely cutting through the drone of cicadas and the distant thud of artillery. Snake, barely out of high school, had arrived in country with a fresh face and an innocent grin. Now his cheeks were hollow, his eyes constantly darting, reflecting the deep-seated paranoia that infected them all. He'd seen too much too fast. A buddy's head vaporized by a sniper round, a child with a grenade strapped to his chest, the festering wounds that defied Doc's best efforts. The grin was long gone, replaced by a grimace of perpetual anxiety. "Static and bullshit." Riley, Mac grunted, swatting at a cloud of mosquitoes that had found purchase on his neck. "Just like always. Means we're on our own. Means nobody gives a damn." The truth of Mac's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. They were always on their own. Each step was a gamble. Each rustle in the undergrowth, each sudden silence could mean a tripwire, a pungy stake, an unseen muzzle flash. The enemy wasn't just men in black pajamas. It was the unseen hand that laid the traps, the whispers that corroded their resolve, the very land that seemed to conspire against them. They pushed deeper into a section of the jungle that felt wrong. The usual cacophony of nature seemed muted here. The bird song was absent, replaced by an eerie, profound silence that pressed in on their ears, amplifying the thumping of their own hearts, the ragged rhythm of their breathing. The vegetation grew thicker, more choked, the air heavier with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sweet that Ray's mind struggled to identify. He felt a chill despite the oppressive heat, a prickle on his skin that had nothing to do with insects. The whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder, not words he could understand, but a discordant hum, a chorus of lamentations that seemed to emanate from the very trees. Ray stumbled, his foot catching on a root that seemed to materialize out of the mud. He caught himself, hands sinking into the slime, but the brief loss of footing sent a jolt of panic through him. He imagined eyes, thousands of them, watching from the dense foliage, waiting, calculating. Was it the VC, or was it the jungle itself? A malevolent consciousness observing their slow, agonizing decline? They moved for what felt like hours, their sweat soaking them to the bone, their muscles screaming in protest. Then, through a gap in the dense green curtain, Mac held up a clenched fist. Silence descended, immediate and absolute. Ray's heart hammered against his ribs. He squinted through the gloom. Ahead, the jungle opened into a small, irregular clearing. It wasn't natural. The trees around its perimeter had been systematically cut or pushed back, creating a ragged, unholy amphitheater. And in the center of it, something stood, or rather hung. Snake choked back a gasp, a sound that was half sob, half retch. Doc Miller's face went ashen, his mouth tightening into a grim line. Even Mac, usually stoic, stiffened, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. What they saw defied comprehension, transcended mere horror. Hanging from the branches of a stunted banyan tree, arranged in a crude, macabre display, were effigies. Not simple scarecrows, but grotesque, life-sized figures, crafted with a horrifying precision. They were fashioned from American fatigues, stuffed with leaves and rags, but their heads were disturbingly real. Discolored, shrunken, and intricately woven with strands of hair and sinew, they were unmistakably human, shrunken heads bearing the distorted features of young men, their mouths agape in silent screams. And that wasn't the worst of it. Each effigy was impaled with various objects. Discarded rations cans, empty shell casings, rusted dog tags, and most horrifyingly, crudely carved wooden stakes that had been driven through their chests and faces. Around their feet, forming a chilling circle, were dozens of human bones, bleached white, arranged like macabre stepping stones, and painted on the tree trunk, in a dark, viscous substance that was undeniably blood, were symbols that Ray didn't recognize, but whose intent was chillingly clear. A message, a warning, a declaration of absolute, inhuman savagery. "Jesus Christ," Snake whispered, his voice trembling on the verge of breakdown. He clutched his rifle like a lifeline, his knuckles white. What is this?" Mac had his M16 raised, scanning the perimeter, his face a mask of primal fury and cold dread. "VC mind games," he rasped, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Psychological warfare." But this felt like more than just psychological warfare. This felt like a sacred, unholy ritual. The jungle had allowed this place to exist, nurtured it, watched it. It was a wound festering in the heart of the green, and they had stumbled into it. Ray Molina didn't speak. The whispers in his head had coalesced, not into gibberish now, but into a single, piercing thought, clear as a bell, louder than any artillery. "They want to break you. They want you to become one of them." His eyes were fixed on one of the shrunken heads, the features still discernible, a pale, wide-eyed youth whose face seemed eerily familiar, a ghost from a photograph. Was it a real soldier? Had they taken his head? Or was it just a prop, designed to push them over the edge? The ambiguity was a blade twisting in his gut. Doc Miller, after an initial moment of frozen horror, forced himself to move. He approached the grotesque display, his medic's curiosity warring with his revulsion. He bent down, examining the bones, the effigies. "These heads, they're old," he murmured, his voice strained. "But the arrangement, it's fresh. And the blood, it's not entirely dry." He looked back at Mac, his eyes haunted. "This isn't just about us, Mac. This is for anyone who finds it." A statement. The air grew heavy with a new kind of dread. This wasn't a tactical ambush. This was an assault on their souls, a deliberate, meticulously crafted piece of pure terror. The VC were showing them what they were capable of, not just with bullets and bombs, but with an understanding of what truly broke a man. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the dense jungle behind them. Snake yelped, spinning around, emptying a burst of M16 rounds into the shadowy undergrowth. The metallic staccato ripped through the silence, violent and jarring. "Hold your fire, Riley," Mac yelled, but it was too late. The jungle remained silent, unmoving. No return fire, no movement, just the ringing silence and the acrid smell of gunpowder. "I heard something, Mac. I swear." Snake's voice was high-pitched, frantic. Something moved. Mac stared at him, then back at the macabre display. The enemy wasn't there to fight them. They were there, or had been there to show them. And now, they were gone, leaving only their message to rot in the sun. Ray Molina felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in his throat. It was the purest form of victory for the enemy. They didn't need to kill them physically. They were killing them from the inside out. He looked at the shrunken heads again, and this time, he saw them blink. Their mouths moved, forming silent words, the same whispers that had been plaguing him for days. "You're next. You're already one of us. Welcome to the jungle." He felt a deep, profound despair wash over him, colder than any rain, heavier than any mud. The jungle was no longer just an adversary. It was an accomplice, an active participant in their psychological unraveling. It had borne witness to this obscenity, and now it was bearing witness to their reaction, drinking in their fear, their horror, their slipping sanity. "We're pulling out," Max said, his voice clipped, devoid of emotion. "Now, nobody touches anything. And nobody talks about this." He looked from Snake's wide, terrified eyes to Doc Miller's grim acceptance, and finally to Ray Molina, whose gaze was fixed on the gnarled tree, a vacant, unsettling smile beginning to form on his lips. The retreat was agonizing. Every shadow seemed to hold a new horror, every rustle a fresh threat. They moved with a desperate urgency, propelled by the images burned into their minds. The jungle closed in behind them, reclaiming its secrets, its horrors. But it couldn't reclaim what it had planted in their minds, the seeds of madness that had taken root, watered by fear and fertilized by despair. Ray Molina walked, but it wasn't him anymore. It was a hollowed-out shell, echoing with the whispers, the lament of the gibbon, and the silent screams of the shrunken heads. He was no longer just seeing the war. He was becoming it, one tortured breath, one festering wound, one lost soul at a time. The maw of the jungle had opened, and he had stepped willingly inside. Ray Molina's feet moved, but they weren't his feet. They were roots, gnarled and thick, dragging through the sodden earth, each step a further entanglement into the jungle's suffocating embrace. The green was no longer a color. It was a physical weight, pressing down from above, closing in from the sides, a vast chlorophyll-choked maw that had swallowed the sky whole. Sunlight, when it dared to pierce the canopy, came not as warmth, but as a blinding, surgical probe, illuminating the swirling motes of humidity and the grotesque dance of insects, before vanishing again into the oppressive gloom. He hadn't eaten in days, weeks. The concept of time had frayed, then snapped like a rotten vine under the weight of too many monsoons. His stomach, a hollowed-out drum, beat a slow, mournful rhythm against his ribs. Thirst clawed at his throat, a constant, abrasive whisper that joined the chorus of other whispers. "Dash, why? Why us? Why here? Why not me?" They were not distinct voices, but a pervasive, collective groan, the lament of 1,000 lost souls exhaled by the very air he breathed. Each breath was a struggle against the damp, heavy atmosphere, each exhalation a cloud of mildewed despair. The shrunken heads had started to follow him, not literally, not at first, but in the way a man remembers a melody he can't quite place or is sent from a dream that lingers. They were there, just at the periphery of his vision, in the twisted knots of roots, the dark hollows of ancient trees, the way the light played tricks on the dense foliage. Their eyes, once vibrant, now dark, hollow pools, seemed to track his every stumbling movement. Their silent screams were the loudest of all, a sound that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in the brittle bones of his skull, a pure, unadulterated agony that transcended noise. He saw them the way the leaves curled, the way the moss grew, in the pockmarks on the muddy ground where spent brass had fallen. They were the silent witnesses, the permanent residents of this green hell, and he was becoming one of them. Their leathery faces, perpetually fixed in a rictus of horror, mocked his fading sanity, promising him a place among their number. His M16, once an extension of his will, was now a dead weight, a cold, alien thing slung across his shoulder. He'd forgotten its purpose, or perhaps its purpose had changed. It was a talisman against something shapeless and formless, a constant, humming dread that had replaced fear. Fear was for those who still had something to lose. Ray Molina had lost everything: his name, his home, his future, his mind. He was a walking ghost, a spectral echo of a man who once was, now trapped in a perpetual waking nightmare. Every fiber of his being was saturated with the smell of decay, of gunpowder, of the unwashed sweat of men long dead. He remembered a face a long time ago. Johnson? Or was it Jackson? The face of a boy from Ohio, red dirt still clinging to his boots. Johnson had screamed when the bamboo stakes went through his Achilles tendons, and Ray had heard that scream again and again, echoing back from the gibbon's wails. The primate's calls were no longer just animal sounds. They were the collective anguish of the jungle, translated into a mournful, drawn-out cry that pulled at the very fabric of his sanity. Oh waho, uwh. Each repetition was a thread unraveling in his brain, each note a barb tearing at the fragile remnants of his humanity. He stumbled into a clearing, or what passed for one, a patch of ground where the canopy thinned, revealing a sky the color of bruised plums. The air was thick with the scent of decay, sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun. It was the smell of dead things, a constant perfume of the jungle, a promise of what was to come. He saw them then, not just in his mind, but real, or real enough for him. A cluster of figures slumped against a fallen log, their uniforms tattered, faces obscured by the gloom and the passage of time. VC, perhaps, or ARVN, or Americans. It didn't matter. They were all just flesh returning to the earth, devoured by the jungle. Bloated, blackened, indistinguishable lumps of meat and bone, dissolving into the voracious soil. But one figure closer to him seemed different. Its head was unnaturally tilted, its mouth agape in a rictus of silent agony. And hanging from its neck, on a frayed leather thong, was a tiny, grotesque head, no bigger than his fist, with desiccated skin pulled taut over bone and dark, empty eye sockets. The lips were sewn shut with what looked like coarse twine, but the agony was unmistakable. Ray stared, not with revulsion, but with a strange recognition. A communion. They are here, Dash, he thought, the thought a slow, viscous syrup seeping through his brain. They are real, and they are waiting. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch, but to acknowledge. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. The gibbons fell silent. Only the buzzing of flies, fat and sluggish, broke the oppressive quiet. He felt a profound sense of kinship with the tiny, mummified visage. It was a mirror, reflecting the horror he carried within. He saw the tiny head's eyes then, not empty, but filled with a profound, ancient sorrow. It wasn't screaming silently anymore. It was weeping. Weeping for the countless dead, for the endless suffering, for the madness that had consumed this land and its inhabitants. He saw his own reflection in those dark, shrunken eyes, and it wasn't Ray Molina looking back. It was a stranger, gaunt and wild-eyed, a shadow wearing human skin, the war etched into every sinew, every muscle, every desperate breath. His own eyes, when he blinked, felt gritty like sand. A rustle in the undergrowth snapped him back, or forward, or sideways, into another layer of distorted reality. Figures moved, not the dead. These were alive. Glimpses of green, snatches of movement. He raised his M16, but his fingers were clumsy, numb. Was it them, the enemy? Or was it his own patrol, long lost, now returning to claim him? He couldn't tell. He couldn't differentiate. Everyone was a threat. Everyone was a ghost. His paranoia, a constant hum, now roared to life. The whispers intensified. Dash, kill them. Before they kill you. Before they plant the seeds deeper. Before you become one of the heads. Before they make you scream like the gibbons. Before they silence you forever. The voices were no longer external. They were the raging storm within his own skull, echoing the jungle's bloodlust. His trigger finger twitched. The jungle, the oppressive, living jungle, seemed to lean in waiting. It wanted blood. It always wanted blood. It had whispered that to him for weeks, days, eternities. Its roots drank it. Its soul yearned for it. He felt its hunger deep in his own gut, a primal, insatiable craving. A cold, detached resolve settled over him, the last vestige of Ray Molina dissolving into the primal urge of the predator. He squeezed. The shot cracked, ripping through the thick air, a raw, violent sound that seemed to momentarily tear the fabric of the green world. A shriek followed, human, wet, and quickly cut short. He heard bodies falling, thrashing. Or was it just the jungle settling, the wind through the leaves, a branch snapping? He didn't know. He couldn't be sure. The madness was a veil, thick and impenetrable, distorting every sight, every sound. He saw flashes of movement, heard desperate cries, but they were filtered, muffled, like echoes from another dimension, sounds of a dream he was no longer a part of, but of which he was the architect. He fired again and again, emptying the magazine into the swirling, indistinct shapes, the spectral enemies, the screaming gibbons, the silent, weeping heads that now danced in his peripheral vision. The recoil was a dull thud against his shoulder, a familiar comfort in the overwhelming chaos, a steady beat accompanying the symphony of his undoing. When the click-click-click of the empty chamber echoed in the sudden, eerie silence, he slumped, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. His breath came in ragged, burning gulps, tasting of ozone and blood. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of gunpowder and something else, something metallic and warm. He looked at his hands. They were caked with mud, with grime, with something dark and sticky. He brought them to his face, sniffing. Blood, his own or someone else's. It didn't matter. It was all the jungle's. It was all his dash. He saw the figures again, closer this time, lying still. One of them wore a U.S. Army uniform. A fresh face, young, wide eyes staring up at the canopy. No shrunken head around his neck. Just a dog tag, glinting dully in the filtered light. The boy's mouth was open, a dark hole, as if trying to utter one last, unheard word. No. Ray croaked, the sound a dry rasp in his throat, a protest that was too little, too late. He tried to speak again, but only a wet cough escaped, tasting of bile and iron. He swayed, the world tilting violently, the trees spinning like demented dancers. The faces of his shrunken heads swirled around him, their eyes now accusing, not just sorrowful. You became us. You joined us. You were one of us. The maw of the jungle had opened, and he had not just stepped willingly inside. He had become its teeth. He had become its digestive juices. He was no longer just seeing the war. He was an active, festering part of it, a disease spreading through the green, humid flesh of the land. The whispers weren't just in his head. They were his own thoughts, twisted and malevolent. The lament of the gibbon was his own tortured cry, a sound torn from the deepest abyss of his soul. The silent screams of the shrunken heads were the screams he suppressed within his own hollowed-out shell, screaming out through his eyes, his gait, his very being. He began to walk again, not knowing where, not caring. The M16 was gone, dropped somewhere in the frenzy. It didn't matter. He was armed now with something far more potent, far more terrifying. He was armed with the war itself, the madness, the despair, the unrelenting horror. He was the ghost in the machine, the phantom limb of a broken empire, forever lost in the green, devouring echoes of Vietnam. And as he walked deeper, the jungle welcomed him, for he had finally, truly become its own, a living monument to its insatiable hunger. Part 8. The Green Devouring Echoes. The jungle swallowed him whole, not with a sudden gulp, but with a slow, deliberate assimilation. The last echoes of human thought, the faint, flickering embers of fear or self-preservation, had finally guttered out, leaving behind only the cold ash of instinct. It walked, not with purpose, but with a momentum that felt ancient, a primeval surge that had driven countless creatures through these verdant labyrinths since time began. The M16, a cold, impotent symbol of a forgotten world, was long gone, shed like an unnecessary skin, swallowed by the grasping vines and the indifferent earth. He no longer needed it. He was armed now with something far older, far more potent, far more terrifying. He was armed with the war itself. It manifested in the sharpened edges of his senses, in the predatory glint that now coated his eyes, seeing not trees and shadows, but patterns of movement, the faint disruption of a leaf, the ripple of unseen life. The smell of rot and decay, the cloying sweetness of jasmine battling the metallic tang of damp earth, no longer repulsed. They were the very breath of his new existence, the perfume of his rebirth. His skin, a map of insect bites and festering scrapes, was no longer his own. It was a rough, leathery hide, an extension of the jungle's imperviousness. Pain was a distant concept, a word without meaning in this new lexicon of primal urges. Hunger was not a gnawing ache, but a deep, resonant thrum, a constant, low-frequency vibration that ran through his every fiber, connecting him to the earthworms beneath his feet, the viper coiled in the canopy above. He was the ghost in the machine, yes, but the machine itself had dissolved, leaving only the spectral imprint of its violence, its futility. The gears had ground to a halt, the ideological cogs rusted and fused, yet the phantom movements continued in him, a tireless, unthinking patrol through an eternal battlefield. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that has forgotten the concept of prey, merely existing within the flow of an endless hunt. His boots, waterlogged and disintegrating, pressed into the yielding mud, each step a soft, rhythmic squelch that was absorbed by the dense undergrowth. There was no destination, no objective, only the ceaseless, forward pull deeper and deeper into the emerald maw. He was the phantom limb of a broken empire, a lingering ache in the collective unconscious of a nation that had tried to grasp too much and lost everything in the process. His presence here, a living, breathing testament to unraveling sanity, was the war's final, cruel joke. He carried no flag, no insignia, no identifying marks. He was the nameless, faceless consequence, a shattered mirror reflecting the true cost of their ambition. Memories, once shards of glass that could cut and scar, were now dissolved, blurred into the verdant haze. His mother's face, a girl's laugh, the taste of a cold beer on a summer's day. All of it had been absorbed, processed, and expelled as irrelevant biomass. There was only the green, the wet, the ceaseless hum of unseen life, and the deeper, guttural roar of his own transformed being. The jungle welcomed him, not with warmth or acceptance, but with the indifferent embrace of a force that consumes all, eventually. It recognized him as one of its own, a creature shaped by its relentless pressures, distilled by its primal essence. He was no longer an intruder, no longer a soldier fighting against it, but a constituent element, a moving piece of its vast, indifferent ecosystem. The tangled roots that snaked across the forest floor were his veins, the dripping canopy his sweat, the ancient, moss-covered trees his bones. His breath was the humid air, thick with the scent of decomposition and new growth. Days bled into nights, weeks into months. The sun, when it pierced the thick canopy, cast dappled patterns on his skin that seemed to merge with the mottled shadows of the jungle. He ate what he could find, insects, grubs, the occasional fruit whose sweetness or bitterness registered only as a fleeting sensation on a tongue that had forgotten flavor. He drank from puddles, from leaves, from the constant, dripping condensation, his body a self-regulating machine, efficient and utterly detached. Sometimes, in the deeper reaches, he would stumble upon the skeletal remains of the conflict that birthed him. A rusting helmet half buried in the mud, a boot with a single bone still inside, the shattered hulk of a downed helicopter slowly being reclaimed by vines and fungi. These were not relics of a past war, but part of the present landscape, monuments to the jungle's victory, and he was another such monument. He would pause, his head cocked, not in recognition or contemplation, but like an animal scenting the air, registering the lingering decay, the faint, metallic ghost of spilled blood. Then he would move on, the echoes of the fallen silent beside the louder, more immediate echoes of his own continued, monstrous existence. He had no name, no past, no future. He was merely Dash, a lowercase letter stripped of its capital, a fragment of language that had lost its meaning. He was the ultimate prisoner, the ultimate victor of the war that had consumed him. He was the perpetual sentinel of the green, devouring echoes of Vietnam, a living monument to its insatiable hunger, forever lost, forever present, a haunting, silent testament to the war that refused to end, even when the last shot was fired. And as he continued his endless walk, deeper and deeper, the jungle closed around him, a verdant shroud, completing its ancient, terrifying embrace.